Who brought rotten tomatoes? Just curious. First of all, I have a story. I have a story about this masterpiece of an opening slide. As many of you already know, I missed my first flight coming to Iceland because I apparently could not understand my boarding pass, and I was waiting for the wrong aircraft in the wrong seating area, and naturally they did not let me board the plane that I tried to get on because it was the wrong one. So as a result, I ended up spending more time than I expected at an airport in Seattle, Washington. And while I was there, I was working on my presentation. I had my laptop open, was working, clicky, clicky. The person sitting next to me, this man, was one of those people who cannot occupy themselves with their own activities, so they have to watch what you are doing, which is so obnoxious, by the way, if any of you are also these people. And for a while, I was working on this opening slide, trying to perfect it clearly. It's beautiful, I know. And as I was sitting there trying to ignore this man, he was watching, I was working, he was watching. All of a sudden, after some time, he turned to me and he asks, completely sincere, "Why do you have a picture of poop with a halo?" That's a potato. Was anyone else confused? I feel bad. I mean, I didn't want to change it because I like this picture. I think it's very charming. I feel bad, however, that I've been invited into this beautiful country, and the first thing I do is apparently display images of excrement upon a large screen. So I am sorry if anyone was confused and offended by this. I just like it. I'm sorry, it's staying. That being said, this is not a poop presentation, just to be clear. It's also not really about potatoes. And it is technically about low-fat diets, but more broadly and more fundamentally, it's about something a little deeper, which is, can you help me? I don't have the thingy. Oh, here it is. Nobody showed me how to do this. There we go. It is about questioning. And not just questioning other people, because that's easy. It's very, very easy to know that everybody else is wrong all the time, and we're right? This is how many of us live our lives. No, I mean questioning ourselves and avoiding the trap of groupthink, which unfortunately in a conference like this, where you have many speakers who are coming with a very similar perspective, giving a very similar message, that can create a premature illusion of consensus. And that's something we do want to avoid, because it's my belief that the only thing more dangerous than a room full of people who hate each other is a room full of people who completely agree with each other. That is what you have to watch out for. So that being said, I am here today to stir the pot a little bit, to challenge some beliefs, present some arguments that may not fit within the paradigms we've been seeing today already. And I do hope that I make everybody extremely uncomfortable. So who wants to leave now? No? You guys are great. Thank you. This will be fun. So the first thing I want to start with is some history. History of the low-fat diet, because this is the first place we get it wrong. Who knows who this man is? Raise your hand. Who recognizes this man? If you don't recognize him like this, you might recognize him like this, which is more often how he's portrayed. This is Ancel Keys, a researcher who is often credited with starting the low-fat movement, being the main voice of it, being the instigator. And as the story goes, we are told this narrative that goes like this. He cherry-picked a bunch of countries, put them on a graph, so that they formed a nice little curve like this that is very compelling, that seems to show the more fat you eat, the more heart disease you get. A very famous graph that we are reproducing frequently today. Now, Ancel Keys, if you ask certain people, was a very forceful, convincing, confident man. He was an Aquarius. He was tall. He was handsome. He was able to convince people of his beliefs. And one thing he did was he did convince the American Heart Association to adopt low-fat dietary guidelines and promote that as their recommendation for cardiovascular health. Later on, another famous thing, 7-country study, which, again, depending on who you ask, was somehow cherry-picked and assembled to fit his pre-existing beliefs. The study was also very influential in making us believe that saturated fat was correlated with heart disease at a national level. Well, after Ancel Keys, we had George McGovern. Who knows who this man is? Former presidential candidate in the US, senator, most famous in the nutrition realm for giving us the United States Dietary Guidelines from 1977, Dietary Goals for the United States, published in 1977, and it was the first time where something government-related had told us to specifically increase carbohydrate consumption and reduce overall fat consumption. And as the story goes, we diligently reduced our fat intake. And the result was we were greeted with an obesity epidemic. Oh, great. So this is the story we are told. There's just one problem. How often do people do what they are told when it comes to eating healthy? Maybe approximately 0% of the time. That's been my experience personally. And when we actually look at what happened in terms of macronutrient intake, we can see that when the dietary goals were released, indeed, there was a spike in carbohydrate consumption. However, fat intake never went down. We never ate less fat. We just ate more carbohydrates. And as USDA survey data seems to indicate from the 1970s, the majority of that carb increase was coming from soft drinks, from processed salty snack foods, from food that was being eaten away from the home because people were cooking less, eating out more, lifestyles were changing. Also, portion sizes were going up. So there was a lot of cultural influence that was being driven by the food industry, trying to insert new meals into the day as snacks that really hadn't been there before the 1970s. And many of those new calories were coming from carbohydrates. So that's why we see this increase. But things get even more interesting when we look a little bit further back in history. This is the USDA's nutrient availability data that dates back to 1909. It's very imperfect, but it gives us an approximation of the amount of macronutrients from each category that were available to each person throughout the years. And what we can see is that if we only look past the 1950s, yes, carbohydrate intake increased, again, around the time of the dietary goals. If we scroll back a little bit further, wait a minute, back in the early 1900s, carbohydrate intake was very similar in an absolute level, number of grams per day, as it rose towards the year 2000. So we can't really even say that our diet was higher carb than it has ever been, and that it remains that way today. It's just not true. Not only that, but things look very interesting on a global level when we consider what other countries are eating too. We can see that as a percent of total calories, America actually has a very, very low, relatively speaking, intake of carbohydrate compared to a lot of other countries. The other countries with low carbohydrate intakes, relatively speaking, include Australia, even Iceland, a lot of different parts of Europe, many places that are also experiencing obesity epidemics. And if we look at total fat intake, relative fat intake, we can see that America, Australia, Europe, Iceland, again, many of the same areas experiencing obesity epidemics, actually have the highest intake of fat. So bottom line here is that we do not eat a low-fat diet in the West at all. We can't really blame anything that's going on the sheer fact that we're eating low fat. And with that being said, I want to go back to the concept of history. And this is a quote by Napoleon that I tend to really like, because the more you think about it, the more true it becomes. What is history but a fable agreed upon? Who tells us what happened in the past? Certain individuals curate selected events that they feel are important, give those to us, and we take those on as objective fact. But there are many different ways to look at history. There are very many stories that are embedded within the timeline of the past that we don't hear. And so today I would like to present to you a new timeline that is hopefully brand new to many of you and will hopefully again stimulate some conversation, some thoughts, and some controversy. So going back to the 1930s. Who knows who this man is? Who knows who this man is who has not read my blog? It's like 0 hands, that's great. This is Walter Kempner. So his deal, he used a low-fat diet. We'll be talking more about him too, by the way. He used a low-fat diet to treat kidney failure, kidney disease, hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, psoriasis, quite a few other conditions. Again, we'll get to him in a minute. Who knows who this is? So this is not a picture of, no, I'm just kidding. I could not find a picture of Lester Morrison, so this is Jim Morrison. Just pretend with me for a minute. This was probably one of the first doctors to use a low-fat diet to treat heart disease, and I do mean treat heart disease in the sense that it got better. Who knows who this is? Oh, one person. This is Roy Swank. He used a low-fat diet in the 1940s to treat multiple sclerosis, and again, I mean treat in the sense that he improved people's conditions. Finally, we have Ansel Keys. What took him so long? He was a latecomer. People long before Ansel Keys were actually studying low-fat diets, using low-fat diets, not on a population level, not using epidemiology, but actually in clinical settings, doing experiments on human beings, using low-fat diets. So Ansel Keys is not really the beginning of the low-fat movement. There are a few people who have been swept under the rug of history, who we've forgotten about, who came before him. And then after Ansel Keys, we do have Nathan Pritikin, who maybe more people know about. Anyone? Still not too many people. Well, unfortunately, we won't have time to talk about him today, but he opened a longevity center and was famous for treating many people who had heart disease and obesity who came into his clinic. He put them on a very, very low-fat diet to help them. Finally, 1977, we have George McGovern. So this is our new timeline that we're going to use today. It's a little bit different than the one you might have seen before. And again, for the sake of time, I had to pare down this talk because the first time I ran through it, it was 1.5 hours long. I do things to excess, I am sorry. We are only going to talk about these first 3 individuals. Any objections? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay. Walter Kempner, fascinating man. 1939, he was living in Germany, and as the war was ramping up, he realized his country was becoming increasingly inhospitable to Jews, of which he was one. So he fled the country, and he landed straight in the halls of Duke University in North Carolina. And it was there where he started doing a lot of experiments, mostly in vitro experiments, not in human bodies, on hypertension and kidney failure. And this was his main focus of research. It was his main interest. Many people at the time had these conditions, and there were no suitable treatments for them. So he was interested in coming up with something to give to humans to make them better. And all of his research led him to discover a theory, and that theory manifested as a diet that he designed, called the rice diet. Has anyone heard of the rice diet? Who has not read my blog? Thank you. So this is what the rice diet featured. Shockingly, it was based on rice. But not just any rice, about 350 grams per day dry weight, which is a ton of rice. White rice, refined starch. Unlimited fruit, another component of the diet. Unlimited fruit juice, oh my goodness, fructose. Get this. People were eating up to 400 grams a day of pure white sugar. That is a lot of sugar. That's almost 2,000 calories from pure white sugar alone. So what happened? Oh, and one more thing. It was not a calorie-restricted diet. The original form was not calorie-restricted. People could eat as much as they wanted. What happened? First of all, kidney failure and kidney disease dramatically improved. Hypertension dramatically improved. That was great. But there were some surprises. You see, Kempner was getting a lot of patients who had diseases other than the things they approached him with. You know, people would come in with kidney failure that was resulting from their diabetes, or they would have abnormal EKGs from hypertensive vascular disease, various conditions. Now, Kempner never intended to actually treat these conditions. He was focused on high blood pressure and kidney stuff. What ended up happening was people would come in with psoriasis. The psoriasis would heal. People would come in with abnormal EKGs. Their hearts would normalize. People would come in with diabetic retinopathy. Their eyes would improve. People would come in with enlarged hearts from their vascular diseases. Their hearts would return to a normal size. And this is the most interesting part. Diabetics. Diabetics, can you imagine diabetics going on a diet that I just described that is nothing? That is a diet of 94% carbohydrate and 2% fat. It is almost pure carbohydrates. So of course, Kempner had diabetic patients that came in, and his expectation was they would get worse because that was his prevailing thought at the time. Lo and behold, one of his most interesting papers has this title. It was published in 1958. And what this paper looks at was 100 diabetics who had all been on his diet between, listen, 3 months and 11 years. 11 years, it's a long time. And this is what he found based on those 100 patients. As expected, 15% of them saw a rise in their fasting blood sugar, but 63% saw their fasting blood sugar drop on this diet. Not only did it drop, but it dropped dramatically. For the people who improved, their blood sugar dropped by an average of over 100 milligrams per deciliter. I have included European values because I realize I am in Europe. And this is an incredible, stunning result from a diet that is almost pure, again, carbohydrate. Insulin. Patients that came onto his diet, already using insulin, of them, 1 out of 4 were able to completely discontinue their use of insulin because their numbers improved so dramatically. A total of 58% of those people were able to at least decrease their use of insulin. How is that for crazy? Again, this is what they were eating. How many people's brains hurt right now? It's a little bit disconcerting, I understand. And this is also very interesting. This is a quote from one of Kempner's papers. Patients were able to transition into a more flexible diet over time while leading a normal, active life without medications, indicating that the disease state had been permanently modified. So basically, diabetics would come on this diet, spend some time eating absurd amounts of rice and sugar, find that their numbers normalized, were able to wean themselves onto diets that included a wider variety, thank goodness, of foods, and they never needed to use insulin again. They were effectively cured. Mind-blowing. I see everybody looking kind of disturbed right now. That's okay. Well, trust me, it'll all make sense by the end, I promise. So another very interesting finding of his. There was a version of the rice diet that was calorie restricted. And if you are somebody who believes that calories are really what matter, energy intake versus energy output, then these results will not be surprising because these people were forced to eat fewer calories than they normally would need to survive. Well, what happened is Kempner published this also very interesting paper that looked at 106 consecutive patients who were overweight or obese, who entered his program, and lost at least 45 kilograms with an average loss of 63 kilograms. So consuming this diet, we saw transformations like this. This woman lost 56 kilograms in less than a year. This man lost 126 kilograms in just over a year. This woman lost 52 kilograms in 33 weeks, and her fasting triglycerides dropped from incredibly, scarily high to normal levels on this crazy, crazy rice diet. Now, one question we might ask is what happened to these people after they finished the diet? Did they just rebound? Did their weight go back up? Because that's usually what we see with quick fix kind of diets. Well, actually, according to some of the analyses of the rice diet, 43% of the people who lost weight, dramatic amounts of weight on this diet, were able to keep it off at the 6-year mark when they were given a follow-up. So 6 years, they were able to maintain that crazy weight loss. And this is actually an amazing figure because on average, when people lose a significant amount of weight, only 20% of them are able to maintain that loss for even just 1 year. I know, you guys are looking really, really freaked out right now. I'm very sorry. So that was Mr. Kempner, and now we're back to Jim Morrison, AKA Lester Morrison. I'm sorry, again, I could not find a picture. So next figure in our historical lineup is this guy. Not really, we're pretending. Lester Morrison was a gastroenterologist based in Los Angeles. He was a doctor, and his whole interest was heart disease. Even though he was a gastroenterologist. What happened was he became fascinated by statistics that were coming out of Europe from World War II, showing that areas that had been rationed with meat and dairy, that their intake of fat had been dramatically lowered due to the war, were actually seeing improvements in their heart disease rates. And elsewhere, I have criticized using this data for anything coming out of the war. There's a lot of problems with using it, a lot of different confounders. So I'm not saying that this was a valid assumption on his part. But he was so interested in what had happened in Europe that he wanted to see if replicating the diet on people, human beings that were not in the midst of war, would have a similar effect on their cardiovascular health. So what he did was he took 100 cardiac patients who had very, very recently suffered from a heart attack. He put 50 of them on a war rationing diet where the only change was they were asked to keep their fat intake down to 20 to 25 grams of fat per day, which is very low. The other 50 were allowed to eat whatever they wanted, continue their normal diets. What happened? Oh, sorry, one more thing. We need to emphasize that the only change these people that we can see made was the elimination of oils, reduction of fat intake from butter, from whole milk, from nuts, avocados, egg yolks, olives, and so forth. So they were allowed to eat as much carbohydrate, as much refined sugar, and as much refined grains as they wanted. Because again, this was back in the 1940s, before we were being told as a public population that sugar might be bad for us. That was not even really on anyone's radar at this time, not on a big scale. So it's not like these people went on a diet they believed to be healthier and decided to make some new additional changes on top of reducing fat intake. It wasn't a well-controlled study, but there was really only one variable that was changed. And what happened? This is a graph showing different follow-up periods, 3 years, 8 years, and 12 years after these people began the diet. What we can see is that by the 12-year mark, every single one of the control group was dead, and 34% of the low-fat diet group was still alive. Most of the control group had indeed perished from heart disease, and the rest did remain alive for 12 years after that heart attack that they had. Interesting, we might say, well, this is just one study, it was pretty small, but these results have actually been mirrored in other studies that have been more recent. One is by this man, Caldwell Esselstyn. Does anyone know who this guy is? No, a couple people. So he's more popular in the US. He's very famous for being the doctor for former President Bill Clinton after he started suffering from heart problems. And what Mr. Esselstyn did was he would put patients on a very, 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 very low-fat diet. Not a single drop of oil was allowed on the diet. Could never use olive oil, couldn't use coconut oil, couldn't eat meat, couldn't eat dairy. Basically, it was about 9% fat. It was a very low-fat diet. And so he conducted one study using only 18 patients. He was able to halt the progression of heart disease in 100% of them using this diet. Again, very low-fat, very, very high-carb diet. And he was actually able to reverse heart disease measured in 73% of those people. Actual reversal of heart disease. Now, of course, this study was widely criticized, including by myself, for being so small. It's like 18 people. Does that really reflect the normal population? Maybe something was going on. Was that statistically significant? I don't know. So Esselstyn addressed those criticisms. Of course, he probably didn't do it just for me. He probably did it for a lot of different reasons by doing another study that was at least 3 years long, people who had been on this diet for at least 3 years. And this one used 198 people, a lot more. 177 of those people were able to stick to his diet. The others fell off the wagon, which sucks for them, but it's kind of good for us because they served as an accidental control group, people who were not adhering to the diet versus people who were. What happened? Reversal of heart disease was documented in 22% of the population that adhered to his diet. More importantly, only one person in that whole successful adherent group suffered any type of cardiovascular event. One person had a stroke. Not a single one of the 176 other people with severely advanced heart disease had any problems during the duration of the study. And again, they were documented this for, it was between 3 and 5 years that these people were following the diet. And meanwhile, 62% of the group that failed to stay on the wagon experienced cardiovascular events. So that's a pretty dramatic difference. So can we really say that low-fat, high-carb diets categorically are bad for cardiovascular health when these very diets, when they're truly low-fat, very, very, very low-fat, have been shown with evidence in clinical settings to reverse heart disease? We need to refine the way we're looking at these things. So moving on. Mr. Roy Swank. Again, not too many people knew about this man, but he is awesome because he's from Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm from. Everyone from Oregon is awesome. The rumors are true. And his whole deal was studying multiple sclerosis. The 1940s, MS, for people who don't know here, is a very devastating degenerative condition, neurological in nature. And essentially, back in the 1940s, it was so poorly understood that there were no treatments for it. If you were diagnosed with MS, it was an early death for you, almost guaranteed. So what did Roy Swank do? He used some survey data that he had gathered from Norway, which seemed to show that areas in the mountains where there were more farming regions focused on milk and meat were getting more MS than the regions that were coastal and eating more fish. On top of that, he combined that observation with some rodent studies that he did and also observed other people doing, which I'm not a big advocate of rodent studies, but he did use them at the time because he had limited evidence. And he combined these two things to come up with a theory, a vascular theory of multiple sclerosis. And his theory was that a combination of genetic susceptibility and dietary triggers were what caused MS to progress in certain individuals. And his main trigger that he identified and believed was that saturated fat was the trigger for these conditions. Let me remind you, this was many years before Ansel Keys started villainizing saturated fat. So if anything, if we want to blame anybody, we can blame this charming fellow back here. Not that guy, Roy Swank. I thought the picture was different. I'm very sorry. So what ended up happening is, there we go, is Mr. Roy Swank. See, he looks very dangerous, doesn't he? Just terrible, terrible man. No, what he did was he took 150 patients with multiple sclerosis, and he put them on a diet that was low in total fat, very low in total fat. More specifically, it was very, very low in saturated fat, 10 to 15 grams per day maximum, hopefully less than that, which meant no saturated fat from meat and dairy products mostly. Small amounts of vegetable oil and fish oil were allowed later in the experiment, but not initially. So it's a very low-fat diet. And meanwhile, just like Lester Morrison, sugar and refined grains were totally okay. In fact, Swank published a book about multiple sclerosis that included a recipe section that I recently browsed, and it's basically lots of dessert recipes that are lots and lots of sugar, and he seemed to think that that was totally fine for MS patients. I'm not saying that that's the case, that it's fine. I'm just saying this is what he thought. And what he did was he followed these people for 50 years and beyond. It's a long study. He developed very close relationships with these participants, had them surveyed incredibly frequently to make sure they were sticking to the diet, to gauge what they were eating, take very close records of their diet. And what ended up happening was within 1 year, the rate of MS flare-ups dropped to almost zero. It was incredibly low. It went from pretty significant to pretty low in these individuals. It only took 1 year of the diet before seeing those changes. Moreover, 34-year follow-up, which is a major publication of Swank, which I intended to put the reference on here. I'm sorry I didn't. But at the 34-year mark, he followed up with all of his surviving clients and analyzed the ones who had also passed away, looked for autopsy reports, obituaries, and so forth. And what he found was that after 34 years, those who were eating less than 20 grams of saturated fat, 31% of them had passed away. Whereas those who were eating more than 20 grams of saturated fat, the people who had failed to stick to the diet very closely, 80% of them had died. It's a very, very dramatic difference. Not only that, but if we look at the rate of deterioration, MS is often graded on a neurological scale that ranges from pretty much asymptomatic to dead. And we can see here that people who stuck with the diet, ate a low amount of saturated fat, had almost no progression in grade. It was about 0.5, less than 1 grade difference. So basically this means their disease had stabilized. They didn't get worse, which again, for multiple sclerosis, it's a degenerative disease that for most people does get worse and worse and worse until you die from something related to the condition. Meanwhile, people who are eating, that worked. Okay. People who are eating over 20 grams of saturated fat a day saw a progression of their multiple sclerosis by about 3 grades, which is the equivalent of moving from mild physical impairments to being completely bedridden. so they had severely worsened. Again, the only real difference that we can see here is that their saturated fat intake and the accompanying foods that that saturated fat would come from was different between these two populations within the study. And this brings us to a question that many of you should be wondering, and that I was wondering too for a long time, which is that if we see all these old studies that are producing seemingly good results with low fat, why doesn't it work now, right? We've seen many examples by our brilliant speakers today of low-fat diets not being very effective for just about anything. And the reason, I'll tell you, is this is what I've come up with, is we have redefined what low-fat means. Back when these studies that showed success were being conducted, the definition of low-fat was about 10% of calories or less. More recently, starting in the 1980s, we started to redefine low fat as 30% of calories, which quite frankly, again, if you look at average fat intake throughout the world, this is more like moderate fat to high fat, relatively speaking. I don't mean in terms of low carbohydrate, high fat diets. I mean just on a global level. And this is a concern because back in the early 1900s, 1930s through the 1970s, they're basing some of these research that I've just mentioned, many of them were looking back at populations that seemed to be successful on low carbohydrate diets, low fat diets. And some of those populations were indeed eating very low fat. We had the pre-industrialized Thai who were eating about 9% of their calories as fat, no heart disease among them, no obesity until they became more westernized. Tarahumara Indians, a few of these researchers like to cite these people. African Bantu are eating about 14 to 17% fat, still relatively low. Highlanders of New Guinea were eating a diet of 3% fat. They live on almost nothing but sweet potatoes. They're a very fascinating population. Pre-Western contact Hawaiians were eating a diet of about 10% fat. Traditional Pima, before being westernized again, receiving processed foods that fattened them up and made them diabetic, were eating a diet of about 8 to 12% fat. So these are very, very low fat populations. They're much lower than the 30% we later decided qualified as low fat. And so this is my highly scientific theory. Are you ready? So here we have the spectrum of fat. It can range from 0% to 100%. We already know up at this upper end, there's a magic zone. When you're eating a very high level of fat and a very low level of carbohydrates, you enter a new metabolic state called ketosis. We all know about ketosis, right? Ketogenic diets. Yeah, stuff is awesome up there. Cool things happen. What if, you ready? What if on the other end of the spectrum, there's a mirror metabolic state that happens when you restrict fat to such a low level, it causes metabolic changes. I'm going to call this carbosis because I don't know of any name for it. So we got ketosis on one end, we got carbosis on the other end. And my thought is that what's in the middle here? It is the macronutrient swampland. And this swampland, unfortunately, it's where most of our obesity-producing diets tend to fall. We see that a toxic combination of especially very processed carbohydrates with industrial vegetable oils combine into a gooey mess in the center, mix with some salt, and become highly addictive, maybe cause some changes in appetite regulation. There's a lot of different theories about what could be going on. But the important thing here is what is going on in the swampland. We have the USDA guidelines that fall here. American Heart Association guidelines that fall here, American Diabetes Association guidelines that fall here, American Dietetic Association guidelines that fall here. And most importantly, if you look at almost any low-fat, quote-unquote, study that has been conducted in recent years, it is also going to use a fat intake of about 30%. Swampland values. Of course, it's not going to see that therapeutic effect that we saw in some of this older research. So that also brings us to a new question, which is why? Why does fat need to be so low in order for that magic to happen? And unfortunately, this is where I had to take off a bunch of my slides to make this not be an hour and a half long. I'm sorry, you guys. And I will give you some of my thoughts, some things I've found that I consider very interesting. And before I get there, I would just like do you guys remember when you all laughed and liked me for 30 seconds because of the poop potato? Please hold on to that feeling of love that we all shared, because this next part may be upsetting to some of you. First thing is that, could fat reduce insulin sensitivity? This seems totally weird and like crazy talk, but hear me out. I'm going to tell you about 2 experiments that I love. I love them because they use food. And often when we have experiments that try to study the effects of different macronutrients, what they do is they combine a bunch of hydrogenated soybean oil, a bunch of dextrose, a bunch of maltodextrin, a bunch of fake ingredients, and try to call that food, and then try to extrapolate the effects that we see from those non-foods onto a normal diet. And so they're not very reliable. This is a study that used potatoes. I seem to like potatoes a lot. Not sure why. First potato experiment uses metabolically healthy, non-diabetic, lean adults, and they're given 2 different meals on 2 different days in a fasted state. First meal, a potato, 50 grams of carbohydrate from a baked potato. That's one meal. Second meal, same amount of potato with 50 grams of fat from butter added to it. And the reasons the researchers wanted to look at this was because there is a belief that adding fat to a high carbohydrate meal will lower the blood sugar response. How many people have heard something like that? Add some fat to your meal to make your blood sugar rise less dramatically. There's also a belief that this will lower the insulin response, adding some fat to a very high carb meal. So the researchers wanted to test that, and here's what happened. As predicted, adding the fat to the potato did lower the glucose response, but it did not dramatically, significantly lower the insulin response. In fact, adding fat to the potato caused insulin levels to stay elevated for an hour longer than eating the potato alone. It took a longer time for that level to return to baseline. And what's more interesting is there was actually a potentiating effect on insulin from the fat. What that means is more insulin was needed to handle the same amount of blood sugar when fat was added to the potato. When the potato was eaten alone, it needed a certain amount of insulin to be metabolized, and a certain level was reached in the blood. That same level was reached when the fat was added, even though blood sugar response was lower. So for some reason, the insulin was not being as effective, or it was circulating abnormally. There's some different theories about why that was happening. But again, this is normal people, which again, most normal people, metabolically healthy, don't have to worry too much about their macronutrient intakes. So, of course, the researchers wanted to explore this a little further, and they repeated the experiment using diabetics, people with untreated, so they were not receiving insulin at this time, type 2 diabetes. And the experiment was a little bit different, but very similar. People were fed different meals on different days that were just a potato plus 5 grams of fat from butter, potato plus 15 grams of fat from butter, potato plus 30 grams of fat from butter, potato plus 50 grams of fat per butter. And if anyone here is really like detail-oriented, you can see I actually made each butter pat count for 5 grams, and it's all exact. This is a beautiful slide that took me a really long time. Thank you for appreciating it. So what happened? This is where it gets super, super interesting. Diabetics. Adding fat to the potato did not lower the blood sugar response. So any diabetics who are out there thinking that adding butter to their high-carb food is going to lower the blood sugar response, sorry, that's not going to be the case for you. But here's where it gets very important. Insulin response. The insulin response to a potato alone was lower than it was for a potato plus 5 grams of fat. And then we can see this kind of tops off once you hit 15 grams, 30 grams, and 50 grams. It levels off. But those responses of insulin are all higher than the potato alone. So there's something about adding at least butter, the types of fat in butter, to a high carbohydrate meal that increases insulin levels relative to the carby food being eaten alone. So and this is what the researchers themselves concluded. They said, compared with the potato alone, the increase in insulin area response was evident after ingestion of only 5 grams of fat. So that's a very small amount of fat to be using that's going to already start showing this effect. So if we think about this, and then we think about, for instance, the rice diet, which again was 94% carbohydrate, 2% fat. There was no fat whatsoever added to these carbohydrates. Maybe it almost makes a little bit of sense that this diet could help improve insulin levels among diabetics. It was almost complete absence of fat. In fact, one thing that Walter Kempner, the rice diet guy, said himself in one of his publications was that in his observations, even small or minimal additions to his diet may spoil the entire therapeutic effect. So if people added even just a little bit of fat to all of that sugar, their diabetes would not improve. Many of their other conditions would also not improve. You needed to be pretty strict with that fat intake. And we've seen these kinds of results replicated elsewhere too. There's also a great study that I like that took 13 diabetics, and it started them on none other than the American Diabetes Association diet of the time, which was about 34% fat and 43% carbohydrate. That was the standard recommendation for diabetics. So they were put on this diet for 2 weeks, and their levels of anything didn't really change too much. Then they were switched to a diet that was only 9% fat and 75% carbohydrate. And what happened? Within 9 days, 9 of these 13 people were able to completely stop their insulin and hypoglycemic drugs because their levels normalized. One person had their insulin requirements cut in half. And only 3 people out of the 13 didn't see any improvement from reducing their fat intake pretty dramatically. So again, there's something to this whole very, very, very low fat thing. There's something there that seems to be different than the swampland ratios we're used to using as our definition of low fat. Another quick study that I just wanted to include because I think it's a great one, I think it's very interesting, uses cream. So I mentioned that Roy Swank, one of his theories was that saturated fat would actually reduce the ability of oxygen to reach different tissues, including the brain, including the heart. And he thought that that lack of reaching to the brain and to different tissues throughout the body was part of what would trigger MS in susceptible individuals. I can't really comment on that, but I did find the study that I think is intriguing. And in this study, it was published in 1955, took 14 patients with chest pain, angina. They had a form of heart disease that was causing severe chest pain on a regular basis. And they were fasted overnight, not given anything to eat overnight, went into the clinic in the morning, and they were given a glass of heavy cream to drink, 1 glass of heavy cream. So it's a great study again, because it was nothing gross and weird about fake ingredients being added to a milkshake and people trying to make assumptions based on that. It was a real food, and this was 1955, before dairy had become adulterated with a lot of different chemicals, hormones, antibiotics, and so forth. It was probably a very high-quality product. And after that, they were monitored for 5 hours to see what happens. Now, how many people here have heard of bulletproof coffee? Oh, a decent number of you. So one of the reasons I like this study is because many people who drink bulletproof coffee are drinking a high quantity of dairy fat on an empty stomach in the morning, just like these people were. So it might actually have some practical relevance. So what happened? This is a graph that measures blood lactescence, which is milkiness. It is a marker for fat flooding the bloodstream during the process of digestion. Happens usually a couple hours after a very fatty meal. Your blood actually starts to look milky as chylomicrons start flooding it. And as we can see, this is just one person's measurements for an example. Things increased in terms of lactescence after about 2 hours and peaked around 3 hours. And what are those X's up there? See those? Yes, that is where the buried treasure was found. Are you guys awake? I'm just kidding. That is where this patient started having attacks of angina. At the peak of that blood lactescence, when fat digestion was reaching its peak in terms of entrance into the blood, these men started experiencing abnormal EKGs, and there were 14 angina attacks among the patients. A few people did not get attacks. Several people got multiple attacks. And on top of this, what the researchers were able to measure was a reduction in oxygen carrying capacity. Less oxygen was reaching their hearts, which is in line with what Roy Swank was hypothesizing about an effect of saturated fat on blood oxygenation. And on top of that, platelets and red blood cells started clumping together and aggregating, suggesting a less smooth blood flow. So we might think, okay, well, these patients were diseased. Maybe that just happens after any time they eat. So, of course, the researchers replicated the experiment using a drink that had the same calorie content, same volume, had, objectively speaking, kind of worse ingredients. It had isolated protein powder, dextrin, and maltose. Very refined ingredients combined into a shake that we might expect to be less healthy than cream. What happened? After 5 hours, none of the patients had any type of angina attack, and there were no abnormal EKGs. So something to think about. There might be something to certain susceptibilities among certain people to be sensitive to a high saturated fat intake. I'm not going to draw conclusions right now. This is still something I'm researching. But for anybody who does have any type of heart condition, consuming a lot of saturated fat in one meal might not be the best idea. So this brings us to another question of, well, why bother with the low-fat thing when we see high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets having such good clinical successes on so many different levels? Because fat is delicious. Why would we ever want to stop eating it? How many people are thinking this? It's like, why does the low-fat thing even matter? I know you're all thinking that's okay. So to answer this question, I have an analogy. How many people here have a refrigerator? Oh, look at you successful adults. You guys are great. So let's say this is a cruel world. We are all born with a refrigerator, and we only get one for life. One day, the refrigerator breaks. It is a disaster. Everything is melting. The frozen peas are drowning in their own fluids. It is tragic. What do? We have two options. One is to never buy frozen or perishable food again. We can just pretend we don't have a refrigerator, decide we won't use it again in the future. We could even say and start blaming the frozen food for breaking the refrigerator, much in the way we sometimes blame carbohydrates for breaking our carbohydrate metabolism. Do you see where I'm going with this? We have another option, though, which is fix the refrigerator. So this is what I'm thinking. Low carbohydrate diets are amazing for managing the symptoms and expressions of insulin resistance. If you're diabetic, you can go on a low carbohydrate diet, normalize your blood sugar, normalize your A1C, do great on the surface. But if you ever go back to eating carbohydrates, you will be in trouble. There is still something about the body that is broken. It has not been fixed. It's been slapped with a Band-Aid. It might be a great Band-Aid, and for some people, the refrigerator of our bodies may be permanently broken beyond repair. I'll definitely acknowledge that. But for some people, there may be the potential to actually restore glucose control normally, restore metabolic flexibility, and actually heal things like diabetes. And right now, there is more evidence that a very low-fat diet can do that than a very high-fat diet can do that. So again, it's a matter of what are we willing to risk, what are we willing to play around with. But low-fat, as it stands, may actually have some advantages. And on top of what I just talked about, there's the potential for it producing a healthier gut microbiome. This is another huge issue that we're still very, very early on in our understanding of, is the influence of food composition, different diets on the gut microbiome. We might see that people who have high amylase production, which is a starch digesting enzyme in the saliva, maybe they are the ones who do better on a high carb, low fat diet. People with ApoE4, certain genetic variant, tend to have more trouble with high saturated fat diets. They again may be the best candidates for low fat diets. I don't know, this is speculation. And again, we may be able to heal and restore glucose tolerance, which generally does not happen on a low carbohydrate diet unless there's significant weight loss, which involves other mechanisms. But in general, this could be an advantage to low fat diets. So I would like to leave with this one thought, which is that we have been engaged in a macronutrient war for a very, very long time, decades. The first victim was fat. We decided fat was bad. We fired our guns on it. We told people to eat less. And eventually we started realizing that that strategy didn't work so well. And then we started targeting carbohydrates, where at the beginning of, trust me, this will become mainstream, where there will be carbohydrates singled out as a cause for many, many, many diseases. In my opinion, this is also very narrow-minded. Both of these macronutrients operate in ways that are context-dependent. Fat can make carbohydrates look bad. Carbohydrates can make fat look bad. But in reality, we have these two different worlds that most of the time we consider irreconcilable, mutually exclusive. We can't figure out why one would work and the other one would work, so we tend to choose sides and root for just one. I would like to offer the idea that maybe these two things are not, in fact, at odds. In fact, they can be friends. Thank you so much for not walking out.